Hey, it's Haley. Today we're joined by Logan Cohen for another episode of Therapy Talks. Today we discuss how men show up in society, their inabilities occasionally to express their own emotions. We segue into topics around toxic masculinity and gaslighting. All right. Well, welcome. Good morning, Logan. It's nice to meet you. I'm Haley. So I'm a registered clinical counselor here in Kelowna, BC. And I just wanted to welcome you today. So I thought it'd be really wonderful if you could introduce yourself, your professional background, and maybe some things about you.
Sure. My name is Logan Cohen. My professional background is I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I'm a supervisor with the American Association of Marriage and Family Therapy. And I'm also a level 2 clinical certified trauma professional. Some of the stuff that I do or I'm involved in, I've got a counseling practice where I live in Charlotte, North Carolina. There's a book that I wrote. It was published in December of 2021 called How to Human Up in Modern Society, Heal Yourself and Save the World, that released recently. There's also worked on and developed an online curriculum of self-guided coaching plans, specifically with a kind of cultural competency lens geared towards men, which is super different, but a very missing part of the liberatory psychology movement. If we're going to get everybody at the table and go through some of this cultural deconversion stuff that is oh so necessary for us to become a globally connected community.
I think that's really interesting. It sounds like you have a few different things going on. You're doing a bit of the supervision, running a practice, and then you've written that book. And now you're kind of really your focus on is like, so I would like actually, before I even reframe that for you, because I just want to really clarify, what does that mean when you're saying you really want like the men to have a seat at the table? Maybe you could break that down a bit.
Totally. So something that happens, something that is going on right now is the institutions in modern society have completely lost trust of the populace. And you're seeing the examples of this on so many different levels due to a lack of servant leadership is really kind of what it comes down to. People don't feel like they're being respected as human beings and honored creatures of the earth. So and men have such a huge role in that. We've been operating by the same rigid gender expectations, coming from isolated farming communities based on coercion, manipulation to hoard power and control, as well as a fascination with kind of a perversion of stoicism, not what the Greeks and Romans meant by it at all, but more about emotional restriction, avoidance of showing affection, and the other important parts of being an integrated human being, regardless of what kind of meat suit you have to be carrying around. So knowing that if can help fellas transition the power and control to conceptualization of servant leadership and what's in it for them and why this is so important for their communities and families in the world, as well as from emotional restriction to emotional attunement, we can really change, save the world in a damn generation, right? Like it would all the influence relatively is collected in that eddy pool from patriarchy. And something that happens in any kind of socio-political shifts. I think we saw this with the climate change science, 10, 15, 20 years ago at this point, folks were starting to talk about it, being like, this is the problem. And the approach was so shame-based and forceful that the public couldn't hear them. And we're just now going like, oh my gosh, we're melting. And like doing our darndest to figure it out. Not enough yet, but hopefully. So if we can help bring men into the fold in a way that honors the rest of their humanity, that most people have been socially and culturally conditioned to be blind to, in the same way that white folks have been blind to seeing their white privilege. And bringing them into the collective of solutions. And right now, there seem to be very clear division lines, between the men's rights advocates and all the, there's all this like tribalism stuff. There's no collectively focused narrative and way to help everybody understand where everybody is coming from. Really unfortunate.
So you gave that example of like climate change and how there was like a lot of information coming out many years ago regarding like how important this issue is. But you were saying that because of the way that it was shared, people were unable to take in that information in a helpful way. And so they shied away from it.
Yes, but it doesn't, it's not in a dialogue promoting way.
So could you just help me to understand and how that relates to just like a man and the man's experience? And I'm just a little confused on that piece.
Totally. So a lot of times the concepts that we're seeing being, there's so much more elevation of critical consciousness and critical awareness and intersections of oppression. And that is incredibly important if we're going to again, have all the voices at the table for upgrading the human race and becoming what we're capable of becoming. All of the social and cultural markers of what men are taught that they're supposed to be and identify with contraindicate valuing human life, valuing their own life, valuing others. It's this very traditional hunter warrior, now it's called protector provider stuff. It's the same old crap that is incredibly objectifying, and a lot of men don't even understand what they don't understand, because how could they know what they don't know? And a lot of times regionally, I do a lot of training with local clinicians around cultural competency with men, and how to how to move past a lot of what our assumptions are about how men and women are different, and challenging ourselves to hold these the shadow of men accountable so that they can have a chance of integrating it. If we just keep shaming it and scaring it, it doesn't do much help for engaging them. And since I happen to be a human in a male meat suit who who's Jewish, and right now I'm kind of dark because it's summertime, but I get super pass for a white dude with a shaved head most of the year, and I can be in a position where I'm engaging these fellas that are not willing to be engaged in other ways, and that in many ways have been written off by other really important parts of the human rights movements, that we're going to have to do it all together. Then anybody or any people that don't feel the warmth of the fire of the village will light it on fire just to feel its warmth, right? This is an old African proverb. And that's what we're seeing with all the gun violence. And that's what we're seeing is this awful stuff happening that's largely driven by all these traditional masculinity markers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. So like, for example, at the beginning, you were sharing how like all men have to, in quotation marks, behave in a certain way to uphold these standards, but those are the driving forces behind a lot of our social, political, safety issues that are happening.
Mm-hmm. And then calling it, like the very popular phrase, like calling it toxic masculinity, you kind of maybe like miss out on engaging at least 50% of male bodies. There's got to be more of the common language and a way of looking at this stuff that isn't shame-based, and that isn't tribalism based.
That's something that I noticed as well. Like when you brought the word toxic masculinity, that was a word that I was kind of thinking about as you were sharing, because it kind of really highlighted what maybe I've been socialized to see as the definition of such. And it's kind of interesting because you're saying like when we use negative ways of describing situations or experiences for shaming instead of encouraging.
Shaming and inviting dialogue or sharing observation, or inviting perspective, or defining what we will or will not participate in this dialogue. All kinds of good stuff from nonviolent communication. And yeah, and this is something that I think is shied away from a lot because it's so sociopolitically charged. And I didn't even know to take a closer look at it, even as a man who was in the field, until I was getting word that a lot of my childhood friends were passing away. I was in my late 20s, maybe early 30s at that point, and gotten news that like a sixth childhood friend died from overdose. Been a lot of these deaths of despair, kind of a pissed off, high risk behavior adolescent. And a lot of folks don't course correct from there. And I kept getting this information that was happening, like, oh my gosh, like my own friends from childhood are taking their own lives or overdosing or dying from alcohol toxicity without even calling me. And they know that I get it and that I'm a therapist and they're not calling me. This is, what the heck is going on? So I started studying and like looking at deaths of despair, realizing the gender ratio, taking a closer look at all these pieces. And then it started coming together. And I started realizing that this combination of basically the social and cultural expectations for boys are a setup for avoidant attachment and basically teaching them to hyper independent and not really learn how to regulate themselves and be prone to hyper arousal and anger and all this stuff. And then are going through socialization and acculturation that sets them up to be so repressed and cut off from their own emotional experiences and their own love and respect for their own body, that it's a breeding ground. It's like rolling little pit bull puppies and getting them ready for a cage. And it's incredibly dangerous. And that's when I started putting the coaching plans together, because I was going, okay, like these guys are not asking for help. And a lot of times people don't even know there's got to be a first line of defense. I'm also the grandson of an Auschwitz survivor. It was rescued by Oskar Schindler. So there's at this point, a big part of how I operate is like, how can I use my administrative or economic leverage or social location to create space for marginalized voices and or perspectives and empower humanity, and wherever I can, wherever there seems to be a problem. And that was the painstakingly obvious problem at that point. After developing all that, that's when I wrote the book, and been kind of rocking on social media a little bit here recently after it got some traction. But that's kind of the story of why and how I was doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So a lot of your personal experiences of grief and loss, and like your family's history of survival of such a gruesome, world experience, right? And so you're realizing that like you needed to create some inspiration and knowledge and collect that so that you can use the privilege that you have where you are in your life to kind of change that way that lots of males are interacting, right? Because when you were speaking, it really made me think of a client that I saw recently. Young man, I'm making the assumption he reached out to me as a young person, so there was some generational connection. And he was sharing how unfortunately his partner had lost her mother recently. And for the last 2 to 3 years, he had not once shared to her how he was feeling. He felt as though like the grief that his partner was experiencing could not be could not be held for a moment to the side or in with his experience of the anxiety he's experiencing. And he was baffled at the idea through our discussion that he was allowed to share his emotions, that he didn't have to keep that inside, and that he was still a wonderful partner if he were to start a sentence with, "I feel."
And absolutely, that's a great example of that. In that position, what's going on is that fella has been conditioned to believe that they can't be a good protector while emoting vulnerability or even allowing the open expression of vulnerability from their partner. You know, however, kind of reframing this stuff, expanding the level of consciousness to incorporate a little bit more anthropological context so folks can have some more information and see why things exist as they are, and then decide, hey, how much of this is actually working? And what it comes down to is you're only a good protector if people feel safe around you. And that's done largely through creating emotional safety and emotional intelligence and all these pieces. So yeah, absolutely.
Totally. Because you make a really great point that like safety to some extent is with outside of our control. Like we can look both ways when we cross the street and wear our seatbelt, but at the end of the day, we actually can't 100% control our safety. But it's that experience of safety that we create through, like you said, the emotional connection, through communication, through holding space and being there for the people around us.
Absolutely. And yet men have no idea how to do this stuff. Like they are, in large in part, I know there are like probably a lot of well-meaning, super, academia, the educated folks that are listening going like, I'm a guy and I can do that stuff. I'm probably not talking about you, but however, you probably are not as good at it as you think you are. If you haven't been to couples therapy recently.
For sure.
And it is super clunky.
And isn't it interesting that we almost also make societal like tropes and jokes about the lack of men's ability to communicate emotionally, and it becomes like this thing that we see society that almost like reinforces it in some ways. And
absolutely
what
reinforces it.
Yeah.
It absolutely reinforces it.
And
right.
It also makes it like, I don't know, like sometimes I've spoken to men personally or professionally, and they're like, well, I'm just a guy, so it's fine. It's okay. And they feel like it normalizes it and makes it accepting.
It is internalized oppression. It is hard to see it as such, but parts of their humanity are being oppressed and objectified, and they believe that they have to do that in order to not get voted off the island as a fundamentally collective species.
Mm-hmm.
It's a huge problem. However, when we start reframing this stuff, a lot of times, maybe like I find 1 out of 10 guys that I've run to in clinical spaces go, you know what? I don't want any of that. This is all too uncomfortable and woo-woo, and I'm not going to do it. 1 out of 10, maybe 10%. I would say 90% of folks are going like, oh my gosh, there are all these different notes in music to play with people, and I'm just like rocking an A and C power chord over and over again. I want to play music. And like, cool, let's go play. Like, let's figure it out. And have so much, higher quality and meaningful. And this is really the piece that starts setting off human connection. That movie Avatar, right? Where like their plugs going like their brainstem plugs into home tree and into each other. I mean, like we literally do that, not as literally as whatever those beings were. However, we do that. This is how we tap into this, the power of the collective. And a lot of, most men are running around as lone wolves, confused and don't even get it.
Mm-hmm, definitely. And like an example that comes to mind when you spoke about how if a man were to share their feelings or maybe behave in a way that it's opposite of the norm, it made me think of a client who expressed that within his male friend group, they would joke and call each other like insultive names in a joking way. But in a session, we broke down, he was like, I don't know how to handle this because sometimes I just am offended. And he's like, I don't want to be seen as too sensitive if I were to say, hey, that you joked with me too far.
And yet we're literally taught to it's called ribbing.
Mm-hmm.
And what the function is, as far as social policing, is to toughen each other up. It's like if you see something that that a male friend perceives as insecure or a weakness, what we're taught that we're supposed to do is give them crap and roast them about it so they can compartmentalize it more, or so we can prepare each other to be even more restricted and hard to read. Everything is still a preparation for battle and hunting that is totally contraindicative to humans being integrated.
So here's a question, just devil's advocate for a moment. Wouldn't it be realistic to, like, and I may be completely wrong, but wouldn't it be realistic almost to encourage more strength and resiliency through those sorts of acts, just against society as a whole or life's challenges? Or is that only being restricted?
How would you define strength and resiliency?
That's a really big question within itself, right? I'm just trying to use some words to describe my thought process here, because I do believe that life is very challenging and hard. And
Sure.
So if we never experience hard situations, or hard situations that may be in a more safe space, would we not have the opportunity to learn and grow to experience other situations? You know what I mean?
How are we not discussing that?
I don't know.
I think we
like,
are.
I'm just curious, right?
Yeah.
Because
I think what we're discussing is being able to access a full range of human emotion consciously, rather than having to repress it and be driven unconsciously and reacting, largely with the environment. That's not an empowered place to be. So this is precisely that.
right.
Where again, like, men are socialized to be so tough and hard and rigid that they crack. Creating softness creates flexibility. Bamboo is a lot more resilient.
Mm-hmm. Right. That does make a lot of clarity for me. So just for fun, another devil advocate's question, and this doesn't obviously describe everyone, and I don't know where I've read this, so I can't remember the accuracy of it, but is there not some, just within like cisgender women and men, and this idea around attraction, that women generally find certain masculine traits more attractive, and so that might drive some of the biological reasons for reproduction? This is a big question.
I would imagine those are there.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. The evolutionary psychology is a thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of what is talked about in dominant spaces of evolutionary psychology is still kind of white glove anthropologisty. It's still kind of bro sciencey. I think there are all kinds of different folks who identify as being women who are attracted to all kinds of different human beings for all kinds of different reasons that reflect all kinds of range of gender. I'm sure there are a lot more traditional women who are into more like kind of stuff.
Yeah.
However, after living in Portland and being seen as a lumberjack, and sometimes being like, like you're too nasty, and being like, oh, okay. Like at home, I was kind of like an urban hippie, but okay, but everyone has their place.
Totally. And so some of that science was maybe just kind of supportive of those ideas that more masculine was more superior.
Yes. It's just patient.
Yeah. Interesting, right? How we are like taught like, oh, this is science and this is good information to some extent, but then it's really has its own narrative and driving certain conclusions.
A lot of times evolutionary science stuff is rooted in phrenology and rooted in, looking at the pseudoscience of looking at human skulls and deciding how close they were to apes, and how that was correlated to the amount of melanin in their science, basically legalizing racism. This is where the concepts of racism came, were tried to be put into the mainstream, and almost successfully. And all those concepts came from the same place.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So a topic that I did want to kind of branch into. So what we're discussing, what would you say, like, if there's any links to the experiencing of like gaslighting in relationships? I know we're doing a big segue here, so I'd love
No,
if
it's
we could
perfect.
chat about that.
Yeah, so I think that this is actually a huge connection, is since uh, um, men are generally conditioned to be so separated from our emotional experiences, we don't often learn how to explore and regulate our primary emotional experiences and share them nonviolently with our partners using I feel statements, so on and so forth. Um, and instead repress them and become reactive later about something tangentially associated that we're loading abstract meaning into, that nobody else is sharing that reality, probably, which is gaslighting. We would so these, I always got one in around tactics of coercion, manipulation, and a power and control wheel. All of these are either done intentionally, very intentionally, to create, to control someone, leading up to or including physical violence, and or sometimes folks are doing this stuff unconsciously. That is largely driven by all of these other vulnerable emotions that we just finished talking about, that have been repressed, that they don't know how to deal with, that they're just layered under shame, and they're still trying to keep it under in shame-based ways, which again is going to build into anger outbursts later.
So just to clarify for everyone, could you maybe just give a bit of more of a detailed, or you've already given a lot of detail, but more of a clear kind of definition of gaslighting? Because a lot of our audience is just maybe not as clear on that definition. And I find that a lot of many people misinterpret what that word means.
Totally. You are completely right. So gaslighting is when the phrase came about, the word came about from, there was a popular story, maybe a real life situation, where a man who was abusing his wife was using was turning on and off the oil to the house, or the gas, in order to make her feel crazier and make her question her reality more. And that's basically, if you think that this is what it is using coercion and manipulation through the leverage of the relationship to make folks confused about their own beliefs. And what starts to happen is people start to, especially if it's in a relationship that's meeting a lot of love and belonging needs, folks will start having so much cognitive dissonance. Their feelings, like they have such strong opposing feelings with what's going on, being so confused and wrapped around in circles, that the stress goes up to a level where folks start dissociating more regularly and sort of like plugging into whatever the abuser's worldview is, because that's what is going to keep us safe. So it is over time, we'll start creating compounding little t traumas until you start seeing complex trauma responses from this, even without physical violence being used. But gaslighting, in a most like 101 sense, think about it as pop psychology for mental abuse and psychological control and coercion.
Mm-hmm. Right. So
Not
it would
disagreeing.
be, yeah. So it would be, for example, for me to say, Logan, this happened, and you would say, no, that did not happen, or your experience is not valid, or you did not feel this way, or that is not an accurate recount of the experience.
Absolutely. So like and I like this tool especially because coming from a violence prevention and intervention lens, like training in Portland, Oregon, like liberatory psychology, like this is what it is. This is the research evidence-based way to assess for this information. And whether it's looking like denying, minimizing, and blaming, making light of the abuse, saying it didn't happen, shifting responsibility, saying it's your fault, that you deserved it, accusing you of mutual abuse, saying it's just fighting, it's not abuse, accusing you of making them abuse you. All these different ways of it starts feeling like subjectively, that game we play as a kid on field day, like it's always somewhere on field day. Before you have to run in a straight line, you like put the bat on the ground and do circles around it as fast as you can. It starts creating so much confusion that folks have no other choice. A lot of times they can't see it, so it doesn't feel like an option to to leave. That doesn't seem to make sense, because it's like the water is getting hotter and hotter for a frog in a boiling pot. So what they just start to do is internalize whatever expectations they have in that relationship to try to decrease the volume on the outbursts, just getting into that cycle of violence. So then this is what the trauma bond is over time, is people are left with what is basically a combination of trauma responses and Stockholm syndrome that helped them through magical thinking convince themselves that they had more control than they actually had.
Right. I'm going to try and give an example of something, of a situation. So a female client with her male partner in a relationship predefined to be monogamous. The woman was starting to notice things that she felt like were unfaithful on her partner's behalf. So this individual, she would notice things like he would always turn his phone upside down, and he would be out, and then she would find out later that he wasn't where he said he was. And so she then decided to go into his phone, read his messages, and found messages that showed his unfaithfulness. So when she returned to speak to him, the messages were no longer there. He had deleted them all and said, your experience is not valid. This is not happening. You have no proof. And she then resulted with an angry outburst, of course, and to which he even then insinuated that she was crazy for having that experience and for her response to that situation.
Absolutely. And that tends to be what the focus of gaslighting is, to control the situation. And the best way to do that is to get you angry, or to get you as emotional as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And it is pretty sinister stuff. And if it's not a way that you operate or have thought to operate, you really don't think about looking for it. And a lot of times, also going along with these social and cultural preparation stuff, a lot of times men are basically socialized and acculturated to be obsessed with power and control in trade for emotional attunement. And women are generally socialized, insofar as gender, to enable that behavior. Mm-hmm. And to not be able to like little girls being speak when spoken to. You're not allowed to express anger. That's the absolute most taboo thing. It's all this stuff about trusting yourself in speaking up and setting limits that it systematically polices out of little girls, or tries to. And so then you get these adults who are way too prepared to have abusive relationships with each other.
Right. And then we find the cycle of abuse continues. Even if that current relationship were to end, it would continue in other relationships because of the outcomes and the impacts of those experiences.
Yeah. If we get into that situation, there was always some family of origin stuff, tends to always be some family of origin stuff that kept us from trusting ourselves and being like, oh, like that person's like creepy as, like what's going on with that? And after the abusive relationship, even if it is limited to mental and psychological abuse, if it's not something that you did the healing work from, the likelihood of you continuing those patterns is extraordinarily high. And something that I just want to throw in there, especially for the person who is the abuser, a lot of times the general thought process is that, if it's mental abuse, it's not as dangerous. And yes, to a part of that, not as immediately dangerous, according to research, so that folks are most likely to do in the future what they've done in the past. However, what we're also finding is the escalation of behavior from non-physical acts, these power and control tactics, up to physical violence and murder, homicide, is actually a very predictable phase of development. It's all connected. So, and that's something that I think the narcissistic abuse community is setting up a lot of people to get hurt with talking about, because all this kind of no contact talk without adequate safety planning. And it's hey, like, hey, just go not like just go like leave. And that's the highest risk time for people being killed. It's quite dangerous. And that's yeah.
So what you're saying is like we can see the prediction of more likely for physical violence to increase and more likely to occur. And so you're saying there's a lot of sayings like to get out of these situations, just leave. But when they're in that process of leaving, that's generally where there's more likelihood of physical violence and harm.
Yes. Yeah. And it's awesome that so many more people are paying attention to these dynamics as per like pop psychology being interested in it. However, it's also super high stakes stuff, super high risk stuff. And if this is a situation that you're in, you need to contact a local domestic violence shelter that can get you connected to folks who can adequately help you navigate those experiences. Don't stay in pop psychology too long.
Because one of my questions was like how to remove yourself out of a situation of being gaslit.
Walk away.
Well, I just mean like if you find that you're in that experience where you've been gaslit, like what are your options? What should you do? Or how would you like, because I'm assuming when you're in that experience, it's very confusing. You're probably not being able to trust yourself in your own experience. So, but you do have some inclination or understanding or awareness that what's happening is unsafe.
So it's basically like walking past a yard with an unleashed dog that's being really territorial. You don't want to engage too much. You might get attacked. You also don't want to allow yourself to be a prey animal. You don't, try to like tactfully disengage as quickly as possible. Go make notes about what your experience was. Likelihood that you'll need it in the future for legal stuff is probably high, realistically. However, you're also just going to need to have a log of these experiences. So, because this is all confusing, disorienting stuff. But if it's written down in black and white, you can track your experiences a lot more easily, and you're not as subject to the confusion that results from the constant dissociation, like days bleeding into weeks, bleeding into months type of thing that's prone to happening for a victim in that situation. And then as soon as you know what you're looking at and you're ready to call someone for help, you need to call a local domestic violence shelter and start talking to someone about doing safety planning. But someone who is really going to town with trying to use shame and fear is not a well-meaning person. You can be be as clear as you think you need to be about whatever you need, want, or expect in this relationship. However, let's also believe their behavior and that this is a chronic behavioral compulsion that will get worse if untreated. Where do you want to be when that happens?
Right. Because you bring up a really good point that it is chronic, and we have an understanding of where the gaslighting is coming from for the abuser, the person to be insinuating and instigating that, right? But then you're saying on the other end, you want to make sure that you have like really great resources, you're doing the safety planning, you're moving forward in the best way, safest way possible.
Yeah, it does not matter why they're doing what they're doing. It just doesn't. Because chances are they're only half aware of what they're doing anyway. Is the fear aggressive dog that's biting you, if it's got its teeth into your flesh, are you thinking about why it's doing what it's doing? No, it's hurting you. And the unfortunately, for the victim in that experience, you've also gone through a lot of trauma. So the first thing that tend to be looking for is meaning, and like, why is this happening? So a lot of times, some of these pop psychology phrases give a lot of short-term solace because it creates the illusion of meaning and answers. But it's all, as they would say in the South, it's all hunting snipes. It's all chasing white rabbits down holes. Like they don't know. You're not going to get the answer. You're just going to stay stuck in a trauma bond.
Right. Could you give an example of something like that? Like the pop culture, like.
Yeah, the phrase narcissistic abuse, period. is not an evidence-based phrase. And it's being, a lot of times it's being used in a way they're saying, okay, if you're seeing this power and control stuff or this mental, if you're experiencing gaslighting, that's actually called narcissistic abuse, is what pop psychology says. And that means that the person that you're with is a narcissist. And a lot of people go, okay, well, look up the diagnostic features of narcissism, and that fits my abuser perfectly, because it fits all, like it's, of course, like that's what's happening. Who knows why, like what the etiology of what they're doing is, though. That's not actually going to help you calling it that. What it is going to do is give you a space to be stuck in projective anger and blame of the shadow, rather than considering what we can see, what we can measure, what we can observe, and starting to reclaim our own agendas from chasing figments of our imagination in order to convince ourselves that it's going to help us move on.
Right. It's not about really necessarily labeling it. It's more about the actual things that we could do to create safety.
Yes. Yeah. You don't have to know that your partner has a personality disorder to know that they're an abusive jerk.
Mm-hmm.
And knowing whether they have narcissistic personality disorder or not actually won't help you get safer from said abusive jerk or be happier afterwards.
So you're kind of highlighting one of the unfortunate things around media or how we disseminate information, right? We're just giving out information, but it's not necessarily always like the most helpful for those unsafe situations.
Yeah. And a lot of times also media and democracy, which is awesome for sharing information. However, with that being said, people are fallible and we don't know what we don't know, and we're inherently egocentric. So we're prone to piling on our confirmation biases that kind of reinforce whatever we think is supposed to be true, rather than figuring out what else is going on. So it's prone to creating these echo chambers of information that start almost functioning like a cult, where you're like not allowed to access outside information or challenge whatever totalitarian authority figure at the top. And this person tends to be really like getting off on knowing that they have all this influence with all these outraged people that become a tool for them to use to meet their own self-serving narcissistic wounds. Actually, appropriate use of that phrase coming from psychodynamic theory.
Mm-hmm. I've noticed that as well. Like, it's like if you speak up about certain things that are going against that group, it's just not okay. There isn't any opportunity for reasonable, respectful discussion.
There's a thin line between love and hate. And I think one example of that beautiful universal truth is uneducated advocacy groups can turn into hate groups.
Mm. Yeah. Just pausing here because it has a lot of weight to those words, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Totally. And I guess we shouldn't name something, but I'm wondering if we can give a little bit more examples to such.
Yeah. So let's see, the MRA, men's rights advocates, are usually, like maybe 10% of them are actually well-meaning guys. 90% of them are like a click away from white supremacy, alt-right. Let's see, the narcissistic abuse community. Mm-hmm. There's a fundamentalist or extremist versions of that kind of become go castrate all the men groups. Mm-hmm. Let me see, what are other versions of it? I mean, countries, if you want to get even more general. Mm-hmm. Nation lines.
Yeah. Definitely. So far in discussion, was there another direction or something that we've missed that you wanted to be sharing?
I don't think so. I'm having fun rapping with you. I think we're.
Yeah, me too. I'm learning a lot, and it's really interesting. And I'm really trying to be really thoughtful about the words that you're saying, and ensuring that I adequately understand your meanings, intentions, and trying to make sure to break them down for like the lay
Yeah.
person as well.
Thanks. Thanks. I
Yeah,
can
of
be
course.
nerd.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful. I just I always like to ask, because as we start to get closer to the end, want to make sure if there's anything that we've missed or something else that you wanted to
Sure.
expand on.
No, and I really appreciated your question earlier, actually, about like, well, what about the resiliency? What about the strength? And able to, because that's actually a very common question from folks being like,
Yeah.
we got to help make men strong. It's like, well, they're so freaking strong that they're cracking. Like, how is that strong?
Well,
That's a helpful question, you know?
so I'll bring up, and I don't have enough information to, again, to adequately deep dive, but I will say, like, for example, Jordan Peterson talks about a lot about like resiliency of men. And he even says like some examples that if men are feeling a lack of self-confidence, like giving some really tangible behavioral skills of like doing things a certain way to build resiliency, more of a positive mood or more regularity in their schedules and things
Sure.
like that. So, but I
You
think
can,
there's like a difference between some of those things, such as like making your bed every day, making eye contact, a firm handshake, like things like that, versus like some of the other examples that we're talking about, like the inability to communicate freely about one's emotions.
and I think, and that's a really great, and I think even Jordan Peterson, I think he like tried to speak for men, but he's also like, has been raised in the generation that he has.
Yeah.
And he's kind of missing the boat.
Mm-hmm.
This uh I again I've met just as many humans and female bodies and uterus holding bodies who want pragmatic concrete solutions to get unstuck from an immobilization space, right?
Mm-hmm.
That can happen for any of these intersections of humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of times a lot of times men like that stuff. Let's ask the human being across from us, like, you know, what do you want from this process? What do you like? What do you need from it? What do you like about your past experiences? Do you want more of this? Do you want more of that? Often what I find men talk about benefiting the most from afterwards is all this other stuff, the emotional attunement, and servant leadership, and considering purpose, and breaking down family of origin wounds that keep us stuck. There are so many social and cultural levels of avoidance that when you actually give them permission to go there, they're like, oh, I didn't cry at my mother's wedding, or like whatever, which is much more common.
Mm-hmm.
So there's so many men that more than they give credit for, that are just like waiting for an opportunity to be more human. And they don't know how to do it, or
Mm-hmm.
feel like they're going to get bullied if they try, or whatever else.
Mm-hmm, definitely. And even thanks to my own personal partner, sometimes I have to ask twice how he's doing before he is willing to share. I'm like, how's it going? It's fine. How's it going? Okay, well, actually. And
I
even
do the
that kind
same
of
thing,
example, right?
and I'm a shrink.
Yeah.
We're with couples, and
Yeah.
again, really though. Okay, had a bad day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like that permission, right? You said to be able to speak freely and shares one's emotions. So, well, I think it's been so wonderful chatting with you today, Logan. I've learned so much valuable information. We really appreciate your time. And I
Absolutely.
really was like enlightened, because a lot of the times, even for myself, like, so, like personally, I may make a joke about men's inability to communicate and things like that, but I have a lot more understanding as to like what's actually happening. So I really appreciate that.
Oh, absolutely.
Mhm.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I'm honored that I could create a little bit of value and more
Mhm.
understanding for a lot of the influence that we need at the table to heal ourselves and save the world, right?
Yeah, definitely. Wonderful. Thank you so much.